The summer heat pressed down on Cedar Bluff like an iron weight, turning the dusty streets into rivers of golden haze. Even the flies seemed too tired to buzz properly, clinging to the shadows cast by the weathered storefronts. It was the kind of heat that made men mean and women silent, the kind that baked the earth until it cracked like old leather. Eloise Grant stood at her kitchen window, watching the horizon shimmer where the prairie met the sky. 3 years had passed since Thomas died. 3 years of whispers and sideways glances whenever she ventured into town. The good people of Cedar Bluff had their theories about how a man like Thomas Grant, wealthy, powerful, with friends in high places, could meet his end so suddenly. Some said his horse threw him. Others whispered about a hunting accident. The boldest suggested darker possibilities, always lowering their voices when they spoke of the young widow who lived alone at the edge of the wilderness. She pressed her palm against the warm glass, feeling the pulse of heat through her fingertips. Let them talk. Their words couldn't touch her any more than Thomas's hands could now. The sound of approaching hooves drew her attention. Through the wavering heat, she watched a buggy approach, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air. She recognized the driver before he even reached her gate, Samuel Morrison, the widower from town who owned the general store. This would be his 3rd visit this month. Eloise smoothed her dark hair back, though not a strand was out of place, and stepped onto the porch. She didn't bother with a welcoming smile. Morrison climbed down from his buggy, removing his hat to reveal a balding head already beaded with sweat. "Mrs. Grant," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone men used when they thought they were doing a woman a favor. "Fine morning to you, Mr. Morrison." She kept her hands folded in front of her apron, making no move to invite him closer. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He approached the porch steps but didn't climb them, perhaps sensing the invisible barrier she maintained. "I've come to speak plainly, if you'll permit me." "You usually do." Morrison shifted his weight, dust settling on his good town shoes. "It's been 3 years. Mrs. Grant, a woman shouldn't live alone out here, so far from town. It ain't proper, and it ain't safe. I manage well enough, but you shouldn't have to manage." He pressed on, warming to his subject. "I'm offering you a good home, security. My store does fine business. You'd want for nothing." Eloise studied him with eyes the color of winter storms. "I don't want for anything now. Mr. Morrison, you know what I mean." His face flushed darker, whether from heat or frustration. "A woman needs a man's protection, and I need, well, my children need a mother. It's a practical arrangement that would benefit us both." "No." The word fell between them like a stone into still water. Morrison's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "You haven't even considered—" "I said no." Her voice carried no anger, no emotion at all. It was the voice of someone who had learned that feeling took too much effort. "Good day, Mr. Morrison." He stood there another moment, hat turning in his hands. "People talk, about you, about what happened. I know. Don't you care what they say?" Eloise finally smiled then, a small, cold thing that never reached her eyes. "Why should I? Their opinions won't change my circumstances any more than your proposal will. Now, I have work to do." Morrison jammed his hat back on his head, his face now mottled with more than just heat. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Grant, a woman alone, with your reputation. Well, don't expect many more offers." He climbed back into his buggy with wounded dignity, turning the horse more sharply than necessary. Eloise watched until the dust of his departure settled back onto the road. Then she returned to her kitchen, to the bread that needed baking and the chickens that needed feeding, the familiar routines that kept her anchored when everything else felt like shifting sand. By evening, she knew Morrison's rejection would be all over town. The widow Grant had refused another suitor. Cold. They'd say, unnatural. What kind of woman turns down security and respectability? Maybe the same kind who could watch her husband die and shed no tears at his funeral. As September arrived with its cooler mornings and golden light, Eloise had almost forgotten Morrison's visit. She was checking the fence line near the creek when she heard the horse approaching, a different sound this time, the steady walk of a mount that had covered many miles. The rider emerged from the cottonwoods like something formed from shadow and dust. His horse was a dusty bay, well cared for but showing the marks of hard travel. The man himself sat easy in the saddle, broad-shouldered but not bulky, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that spoke of function over fashion. He pulled up a respectful distance from where she stood, touching the brim of his worn hat. "Ma'am, name's Weston Harlow. I'm looking for Mrs. Grant." "You found her." He dismounted smoothly, though he made no move to approach. "I heard in town you might have land to lease, the piece down by Willow Creek, near the tree line." Eloise studied him, this stranger with his soft southern drawl and quiet manner. Most men who came calling stood too close, talked too loud, tried to fill the space with their presence. This one seemed content to let the silence be. "That land's not been worked in years," she said finally. "I don't need much. Just a place to run a few head of cattle, maybe put in a small crop. I can pay fair rent, monthly in advance. Why here? Plenty of land further west." He looked past her toward the creek, where the last sunlight caught the water like scattered coins. "Sometimes a man gets tired of moving further. This seems like good country to stop a while." There was something in the way he said it, a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with travel. Eloise recognized it, the exhaustion that came from carrying something too heavy for too long. "The land's rough," she warned. "Rocky in places. The creek runs low in drought years. I've worked worse." She named a price, expecting him to haggle. He simply nodded. "Fair enough. I can pay the first month now if you'll have me." Against her better judgment, Eloise found herself agreeing. They shook hands briefly, his calloused palm warm and dry against hers. She pulled away first, stepping back to her safe distance. "There's an old line shack near the eastern border," she offered. "Needs work, but the roof's still sound." "I'll make do. Thank you, Mrs. Grant." He mounted again, gathering his reins. As he turned to go, she found herself asking, "You running from something, Mr. Harlow?" He looked back at her, and for the first time she saw his eyes clearly, gray as storm clouds, steady as stone. "No, ma'am, just running to something I haven't found yet." That night, as darkness settled over the prairie, Eloise stood at her window again. In the distance, she could see the small glow of a campfire where Weston Harlow had made his camp. The sight of it should have troubled her, a stranger so close to her borders, her carefully maintained solitude. Instead, she found herself watching until her eyes grew heavy, that small point of light holding steady against the vast darkness. She thought of Thomas then, of the nights he'd kept her awake for other reasons, of bruises hidden beneath proper dresses and tears shed where no one could hear. The town mourned a respected man, a pillar of the community. They never knew the monster who had shared her bed, who had viewed her as property to be used and displayed. Let them wonder why she refused their offers of protection. She had learned too well what protection meant in the hands of men who thought they owned you. But the stranger's fire burned on, asking nothing, demanding nothing, just existing in the darkness, separate but somehow not alone. Eloise turned from the window and prepared for bed, moving through her nightly routines with practiced efficiency. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own whispers and judgments. But tonight, for reasons she couldn't name, the darkness seemed a little less complete. The first weeks passed in careful distance. Weston Harlow kept to his word. He worked his leased land quietly, asking nothing beyond what their agreement entailed. Eloise would catch glimpses of him from her kitchen window, a distant figure mending fence posts, leading his horse to water, building what looked like a small corral near the tree line. It was on a crisp October morning that their paths crossed properly for the first time since he'd arrived. Eloise had risen early to find her well pump refusing to cooperate, the handle moving but producing only a thin trickle of water. She was kneeling beside it, tools spread on the ground. when a shadow fell across her work. "Looks like the leather seal might have dried out," Weston said, standing a respectful distance away. "Had the same trouble last week with mine." Eloise sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "I can manage." "I'm sure you can." He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her tools as most men would have. "But I've got a spare seal in my saddlebags if you'd like it. Seems foolish for you to ride all the way to town when I'm right here." She studied him. This man who offered help without trying to crowd her space. His shirt was rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms marked by sun and labor. There was something steady about him, like an old tree that had weathered too many storms to be moved by wind anymore. "All right," she said finally, the words feeling strange in her mouth. When had she last accepted help from anyone? He returned with the seal and his own tools, then surprised her again by setting them down beside hers. "You want to do it, or shall I?" "Show me." So he did, crouching beside the pump but careful not to brush against her as he demonstrated how to remove the old seal and fit the new one. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and he explained each step without condescension. When he finished, the pump handle moved smooth as butter, water flowing clear and strong. "Thank you," Eloise said, the words rusty from disuse. "No trouble." He gathered his tools, then paused. "I noticed your wood pile's getting low. I'm felling some dead trees on my section tomorrow. Could split extra if you'd like." Her first instinct was to refuse, to maintain the walls she'd built so carefully. But winter was coming, and pride was a cold companion when the blue northers blew down from Canada. "I pay for what I need," she said firmly. "Fair enough." The next day, she watched from her window as he worked, shirt off despite the cool air, muscles moving smooth and sure under sun-darkened skin. He split far more than he'd need for himself, stacking the extra in neat rows. When he finished, he didn't come to the house demanding payment or praise. He simply loaded his own wagon and went back to his land. Eloise waited until dusk, then walked down to examine the wood pile he'd left. It was good wood, seasoned hardwood that would burn hot and long. She left payment in an envelope wedged between the logs. The going rate, nothing more or less. Days merged into weeks, their interactions brief but somehow significant. He'd nod when they passed on the road. She'd leave fresh eggs on his doorstep when her hens were laying well. Neither acknowledged these small exchanges, but something was building between them, delicate as frost on grass. Then came the evening that changed everything. Eloise had been working in her kitchen garden, trying to harvest the last of the squash before the killing frost. The sun was low, painting everything gold and shadow, when she felt the sharp strike against her ankle. The rattlesnake was young, probably confused by the cooling weather, but its bite was real enough. She stumbled backward, heart hammering, as the snake disappeared into the brush. Already she could feel the burn spreading up her leg. The house seemed impossibly far away. She took 2 steps before her leg buckled, sending her to her knees in the dirt. "Mrs. Grant?" She hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly Weston was there, his horse tied to her garden fence. He took in the situation with one quick glance. Her pale face, the way she clutched her ankle, the disturbed earth where the snake had been. "Don't move," he said, already kneeling beside her. His hands were gentle but sure as he examined the wound. 2 puncture marks, already swelling. "We need to get that poison out." Before she could protest, he had lifted her in his arms, carrying her to the house as if she weighed nothing. The feeling of being held, of letting someone else take control, was so foreign that she couldn't find words to object. He sat her on the kitchen table, elevating her leg, then pulled a knife from his boot. "This is going to hurt some." She nodded, gripping the table edge. He made quick, shallow cuts across the puncture marks, then bent to suck out the venom, spitting it onto the floor. His hands were steady on her leg, one holding her calf while the other worked. She forced herself to watch his face, the concentration there, the careful way he avoided causing more pain than necessary. When he finished, he bound the wound with strips torn from his own shirt. "The bite's not too bad," he said, finally meeting her eyes. Young snake, didn't get much venom in, but you should rest. Keep the leg up. That's when she realized his hands were still on her leg, warm through the fabric of her dress, and she wasn't pulling away. The moment stretched between them, taut as wire, before he stepped back. I'll make some willow bark tea, he said, moving to her stove with surprising familiarity. Help with the pain and swelling. Eloise watched him work in her kitchen. This man who had touched her with such care, who had quite literally drawn poison from her body. When had anyone last touched her with gentleness? She couldn't remember. Why? She asked as he handed her the steaming cup. He understood what she was really asking. Because you needed help. That's all. Most men would want something in return. His gray eyes were steady on hers. I'm not most men. She sipped the bitter tea, studying him over the rim. The town warns people about me. They must have told you. They told me lots of things. He pulled out a kitchen chair and sat, but not too close. Said you were cold, dangerous even, that your husband died mysterious-like, and you never shed a tear. And yet you're here. I am. He leaned back, those storm cloud eyes never leaving her face. You want to know what I see? A woman who's built walls so high she can barely see over them herself. Someone who's been hurt so bad she'd rather be alone than risk it again. Eloise set down her cup carefully, her hands trembling slightly. You don't know anything about me? No, he agreed. But I know about running. About carrying things that get heavier every mile. I know about waking up at night and wondering if the past is gaining ground. The words hung between them, an offering and a recognition. Eloise felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure in defenses she'd thought impregnable. You should go, she whispered. He stood without argument. I'll check on you tomorrow. Keep that leg elevated. After he left, Eloise sat in her kitchen as darkness fell, the cup of willow bark tea cooling in her hands. She could still feel where he'd touched her, careful and competent and kind. It frightened her more than the snake bite had. In the morning, true to his word, he returned. He brought fresh game, rabbit he'd trapped, and set about making a simple stew while she rested in the parlor. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable, not the sharp-edged thing she maintained with others. As the days passed and her leg healed, their careful dance continued. He never pushed, never demanded, but something had shifted that night. The walls were still there, but now there were cracks where light could seep through. The town noticed, of course. When Eloise ventured in for supplies, she could feel the weight of their stares, hear the whispers that followed her like dust. That new fellow's been spending time out at the Grant place. Mrs. Henderson murmured to her companion at the general store, loud enough to be overheard. Lord help him, came the reply. Don't he know about her? Maybe he does. Maybe that's why he's interested. Some men like danger. Eloise kept her head high, purchasing her goods with calm efficiency, but inside, the old fear coiled tight. What if they warned Weston away? What if he listened? She got her answer the next day when she found him replacing boards on her porch without being asked. People in town are talking, she said. He didn't look up from his work. People always talk. They're warning you about me, saying I'm dangerous. Now he did look at her, setting down his hammer. Are you? The question caught her off guard. Was she? She thought of Thomas, of that last night, of choices made in desperation and darkness. Maybe, she said honestly. Weston stood, brushing sawdust from his pants. He moved closer than he usually did, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. We're all dangerous when cornered, he said quietly. Question is, what made you feel cornered? She couldn't answer that, not yet, but something in his eyes said he'd wait until she could, until she was ready to let someone see who she really was when the daylight facade fell away. The days after Weston's question passed in a blur of avoidance. Eloise threw herself into preparing for winter, canning the last vegetables, patching holes in the barn, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. She couldn't shake the echo of his words. What made you feel cornered? At night, when sleep eluded her, The memories came unbidden. Thomas's hands, heavy and possessive. The way he'd look at her like she was a prize horse he'd bought at auction. The locked bedroom door. The bruises hidden beneath high collars and long sleeves. The terrible silence that filled the house like water, drowning her slowly. She'd see Weston working his land during the day, always at a distance, giving her the space she needed. But sometimes their eyes would meet across the field, and in that momentary connection, she felt something she couldn't name. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. One damaged soul seeing another. The autumn rains came early that year, turning the roads to mud and keeping most folks inside. It was during one of these storms that everything began to unravel. Eloise woke to thunder that shook the windows and lightning that turned night to harsh white day. The wind howled like something alive and angry, rattling the shutters. She lay in bed, counting the seconds between flash and rumble, when she heard another sound, someone at her door. Fear flooded her body, old and familiar. Thomas used to come to her like this, in the dark, when the servants were asleep and no one could hear, but Thomas was dead. Thomas was Mrs. Grant? Weston's voice, urgent but not demanding. Your barn roof's coming loose. Horses are panicking. Relief and something else washed through her. She pulled on her dressing gown and opened the door. He stood there soaked through, water running from his hat brim. I was checking my own stock when I saw it, he said, having to raise his voice over the storm. That old roof won't hold much longer. Together they ran through the rain to the barn. Inside, her two horses were indeed wild-eyed with fear, pulling at their ropes as the roof groaned and lifted with each gust. Part of it had already torn away, letting in rain and wind. We need to move them, Weston shouted. They worked together in the chaos, Eloise calming the animals while Weston led them one by one to the small but solid tool shed nearby. By the time they finished, both were soaked to the skin and shaking with cold. Come on, Weston said, guiding her back to the house with a gentle hand on her elbow. Inside. Eloise built up the fire while he stood dripping by the door, uncertain. She saw his hesitation and felt a flash of irritation. At him, at herself, at the careful distance they maintained like a third presence between them. You'll catch your death standing there, she said. There are blankets in the chest. While he wrapped himself in a quilt, she made coffee, strong and bitter. They sat by the fire, not speaking, listening to the storm rage outside. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the scar along his jaw she'd noticed but never asked about. Thank you, she said finally. For the horses. Neighbors help each other. We're not neighbors. You're my tenant. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt exposed despite being fully clothed. Is that all we are? The question hung in the air like smoke. Eloise stared into her coffee cup, watching the liquid swirl. It's all we can be. Why? Such a simple word, but it demanded so much. She set down her cup with shaking hands. You want to know about the scars on my wrists? The words came out harsh, brittle. Want to know why I never cried at my husband's funeral? Why the whole town thinks I'm a cold-blooded killer? I want to know whatever you're willing to tell me. His calm acceptance broke something inside her. The words came flooding out, years of silence breaking like a dam. Thomas Grant was a monster dressed in Sunday clothes. The town saw a successful rancher, a generous patron, a grieving widower who took a young bride to ease his loneliness. They never saw what happened when the doors closed. She held out her wrists, showing the faint white lines there. These are from the ropes he used when I tried to refuse him. Said a wife had duties, and he'd teach me to fulfill them proper-like. The bruises on my arms, my ribs, my back, those were lessons too. Lessons about obedience, about being grateful for the honor of being Mrs. Thomas Grant. Weston's face had gone very still, but he didn't interrupt. 3 years I lived like that. 3 years of being his property, his possession. The town ladies would compliment my devotion. How I never left his side at social gatherings. They didn't know it was because he'd promised to hurt me if I spoke to another man alone. Didn't know that the beautiful dresses he bought me were just wrapping paper for his prize. Thunder crashed overhead, making the windows rattle. Eloise barely noticed. That last night, he was drunk, angrier than usual because I'd smiled at the banker's son at church. Just smiled. Nothing more. He dragged me to the barn, said he'd teach me a lesson I'd never forget. He had me pushed against the stall door when his horse, that mean stallion he was so proud of, got spooked by the commotion. She stopped, the memory too vivid, too real. The sound of hooves on packed earth, Thomas's surprised shout, the terrible wet sounds that followed. I could have warned him, she whispered. Could have pulled him out of the way. Instead, I stepped back. I watched that horse rear up, watched it come down on him, and I stepped back. Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of fire and rain against windows. So now you know, she said, voice hollow. I let my husband die. Maybe I didn't kill him with my own hands, but I might as well have. Weston was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, How old were you when he married you? 17. And him? 43. He nodded slowly, as if pieces were falling into place. A man more than twice your age, with money and power and a taste for hurting things. And you think you're the monster in this story? I let him die, she repeated. You survived, he corrected. That's not the same as murder. Eloise laughed, a broken sound. The law might see it different. Maybe, but I don't. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I've known men like your Thomas. Knew one real well once. My father was that kind of man. Taught his lessons with his fists and worse. My mother, she wasn't as lucky as you. She didn't survive her marriage. Now it was Eloise's turn to be silent, watching emotions play across his weathered face. I was 15 when I found her, he continued. Been dead 2 days while I was out working the fields. He said she fell down the stairs. Everyone pretended to believe him because he owned half the county. But I knew. We all knew. What did you do? Nothing. At first, I was a coward boy, scared of his shadow. But one night, about a year later, he came at me the way he used to go at her, and I fought back, broke his jaw, couple ribs. Then I ran. Been running ever since. I suppose, until now. The storm was beginning to ease, thunder rolling away across the prairie. Eloise found herself moving closer to him without conscious thought. Why did you stop here? She asked. He looked at her with those storm cloud eyes. Maybe I recognized something in you. Maybe I was tired of running. Or maybe... He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her hand. Maybe I needed to find someone else who understood that surviving isn't a sin. His hand was warm, calloused, gentle. Eloise stared at where they touched. This simple connection that felt like stepping off a cliff. I'm broken, she whispered. We all are. Question is whether we let the broken places heal or keep tearing them open. She turned her hand palm up, letting their fingers intertwine. It was such a small thing, holding someone's hand. But for her, it felt monumental. They sat like that as the storm moved on, leaving only gentle rain in its wake. Neither spoke of what this meant, what came next. For now, it was enough to not be alone with their ghosts. When the sun broke through the clouds near dawn, Weston squeezed her hand gently and stood. I should check on the animals. Weston, she called as he reached the door. He turned back. Thank you for listening, for understanding. He touched the brim of his hat. Thank you for trusting me with it. After he left, Eloise sat by the dying fire, feeling strange and hollowed out. She'd carried Thomas's death like a stone in her chest for 3 years. Now, having shared it, she felt lighter but also vulnerable, like a hermit crab between shells. She thought about Weston's story, about the boy who'd found his mother and the man who'd finally fought back. They were alike, the two of them, survivors who'd paid in blood and nightmares for their freedom. Maybe that's why his words echoed in her mind as the new day dawned, whether to let the broken places heal. For the first time in 3 years, Eloise thought maybe, just maybe, she'd like to try. The days following the storm were filled with a strange new tension. Eloise found herself both seeking and avoiding Weston's presence. Drawn to him yet terrified of what that pull meant, she'd watch him from her window as he repaired her barn roof, his movements sure and steady, and feel something flutter in her chest that she'd thought Thomas had killed forever. But with that flutter came panic. She'd wake in the night, heart racing, convinced she'd made a terrible mistake in telling him. What if he used it against her? What if he expected something now? Payment for his silence. For a week. She kept her distance, leaving his payment on the fence post rather than face him. When they did cross paths, she'd nod stiffly and hurry past, unable to meet his eyes. Then came the letter. Eloise was returning from town, where whispers had followed her through the general store as usual. When she found Weston waiting on her porch, her steps slowed, that familiar fear rising like bile. "Mrs. Grant," he said, standing as she approached. In his hand was an envelope, and his expression was serious. "This was posted to me, but it concerns you." She took the letter with trembling fingers, recognizing the elaborate script immediately. Jonathan Grant, Thomas's cousin from San Antonio, a lawyer who'd always looked at her like she was something scraped off his boot. "Mr. Harlow," it read. "It has come to my attention that you are residing on property that rightfully belongs to the Grant family estate. I am further concerned by reports of your familiar association with Mrs. Grant, a woman of questionable character whose involvement in my cousin's death remains suspicious. I strongly advise you to terminate your lease and distance yourself from this unfortunate situation. A man of good standing would not wish to be tainted by such scandal. I will be arriving in Cedar Bluff within the month to address certain legal matters regarding the estate. Consider yourself warned." Eloise read it twice, the words blurring as her hands shook. "He means to take the land," she whispered. "Thomas always said, if anything happened to him, his family would see me left with nothing. Look at me." She raised her eyes to find Weston watching her steadily. "He's trying to scare me off," he said. "Make me abandon you so you'll be alone when he comes calling. But here's what Mr. Jonathan Grant doesn't know. I don't scare easy, and I don't abandon people who need help." "You don't understand," Eloise said, sinking onto the porch step. "The law favors men like him. Thomas never changed his will after we married. He liked reminding me how I had nothing without him. Jonathan will claim I influenced Thomas's death, that I'm an unfit widow, and with the town already against me." Weston sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. "Then we need to be ready when he comes. Need witnesses who'll speak for you, documents that prove your character." "Who would speak for me?" she asked bitterly. "I'm the cold widow who never mourned, remember? Mrs. Chen at the boarding house might. You've been buying eggs from her regular. Always pay fair. And old Bill Martinez. You nursed his wife through that fever last winter when no one else would visit." Eloise stared at him. "How do you know about that?" "I pay attention." His voice was soft. "You think nobody sees the good you do, but they do. They just let the gossip drown it out." She felt tears threaten, hot and unwelcome. "Why do you care what happens to me?" He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the prairie. "My mother used to say that people were like seeds. Some grow twisted because that's their nature, but most grow twisted because of the soil they're planted in. You were planted in poisoned ground. Eloise, doesn't mean you're poisoned too." It was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it in his gentle drawl made something crack inside her chest. "I need to show you something," she said suddenly, standing. "If you're going to stand with me against Jonathan, you need to know it all." She led him into the house, to Thomas's old study, a room she rarely entered. From a locked drawer in the desk, she pulled out a leather journal. "Thomas kept records," she said, handing it to him. "Of everything. His business dealings, his punishments." He was proud of his methods. Weston opened the journal, his face growing darker as he read. Page after page of neat entries. Disciplined E. For speaking out of turn, 10 strikes, E. Required correction for looking at young Henderson. Locked overnight. E. Resisted marital duties. Measures taken. Jesus Christ, he breathed, then looked up quickly. Pardon my language. There's more. Eloise pulled out a small daguerreotype, showing her on her wedding day. She looked like a child playing dress-up, lost in white satin and lace. Thomas's heavy hand possessive on her shoulder. I was barely 17. He was my father's creditor. The marriage cleared the debt. Weston closed the journal carefully. This is evidence, proof of what he was. It's proof I had reason to want him dead, she countered. It's proof you had reason to defend yourself. There's a difference. She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. Sometimes I dream I'm back there, in that house with him. I wake up and for a moment I forget he's dead, and the relief when I remember. What kind of person feels relief that someone died? The kind who survived a nightmare. He stood, moving closer but not touching. Eloise, look at me. She turned reluctantly. You're not a killer. You're not cold or unnatural or any of those things they whisper. You're a woman who endured hell and came out the other side. That takes a strength most people can't imagine. I don't feel strong, she admitted. I feel broken, scared all the time. I can't even let you. She trailed off, heat rising in her cheeks. Can't let me what? Touch me. Not properly. When you held my hand during the storm. It was the first time in years anyone had touched me gentle-like, and even that terrified me. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Eloise, I would never. I know. The words came out fierce. My mind knows, but my body remembers, and sometimes when you move too quick or stand too close, I'm back there with him. Weston took a careful step back. Tell me what you need. What makes you feel safe? The question undid her. When had anyone ever asked what she needed? She sank into Thomas's old chair, tears finally spilling over. I don't know, she sobbed. I don't know how to be with someone who isn't trying to own me. I don't know how to trust kindness. I don't even know who I am without the fear. Weston knelt in front of the chair, still maintaining distance. Then we figure it out together, slow as you need. I'm not going anywhere. What if Jonathan runs you off? What if I faced down my father when I was 16 and scared? I can handle a city lawyer with delusions of grandeur. Despite everything, Eloise found herself almost smiling. You're a stubborn man, Weston Harlow. Been told that before. He stood, offering his hand palm up, letting her choose. Walk with me? She looked at his hand for a long moment, then placed hers in it. He helped her stand but released her immediately, letting her set the pace. They walked out into the evening light, past the repaired barn and down toward the creek. The sun was painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and for a moment, the beauty of it pushed away the shadows. I want to fight, Eloise said quietly. When Jonathan comes, I want to fight for what's mine. This land, this life I've built. It's not much, but it's mine. Then we fight. Weston picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water. Together. Why together? She had to ask again. What do you get from this? He turned to her, backlighted by the sunset. Maybe I'm selfish. Maybe I found something here I don't want to lose. What? You. The word hung between them like a promise. Not to own, not to claim, just to know, to see who you are when the walls come down. Eloise felt her heart racing, but this time it wasn't entirely fear. I don't know if the walls can come down. They already are, he said softly. Brick by brick. I can wait while you take the rest down. As they stood there by the creek, Eloise felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, might always be there, but alongside it, fragile as spring grass, was something that felt dangerously like hope. All right, she said. We fight. Together. Weston smiled then, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. Together. They walked back as stars began to appear, not touching but somehow connected anyway. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, Jonathan's threats, the town's judgment, her own demons. But tonight, for the first time in years. Eloise Grant didn't feel alone. And that, she thought, might be the beginning of everything. Jonathan Grant arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, his black carriage raising dust clouds that seemed to announce trouble coming. Eloise watched from her window as he stepped down, dressed in a fine city suit despite the prairie heat, followed by Sheriff McKenna and two men she didn't recognize. Witnesses, most likely, to whatever legal maneuvering he had planned. "He's here," she said quietly to Weston, who stood beside her. "Let them come," he replied. "We're ready." They had spent the weeks preparing. Bill Martinez had agreed to speak on her behalf, as had Mrs. Chen and, surprisingly, the minister's wife, Sarah Holcomb, who'd quietly admired Eloise's strength in the face of gossip. Weston had also discovered something interesting in the town records. Thomas had died with significant debts that would transfer to his estate. Jonathan didn't bother knocking, walking in as if he already owned the place. "Mrs. Grant," he said, the title dripping with disdain. "And Mr. Harlow, how cozy." "Mr. Grant," Eloise replied, keeping her voice steady. "To what do I owe this intrusion?" "Intrusion?" Jonathan's smile was cold. "I'm here on family business. This property belongs to the Grant estate, and as Thomas's closest male relative, the property belongs to his widow." Weston interrupted. "That would be Mrs. Grant here." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. His widow, who, according to numerous witnesses, showed no grief at his passing, who was seen alone with him the night he died, who benefited most from his untimely death. "What are you implying?" Eloise asked, though she knew. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts that suggest further investigation is warranted." He pulled out a document. "I've petitioned the court to examine the circumstances of my cousin's death. Until that matter is resolved, his assets should be held in trust. By you, I suppose," Weston said dryly. "As his nearest male kin, yes." Sheriff McKenna shifted uncomfortably. "Now, folks, let's keep this civil. Mrs. Grant, these are serious allegations." "Based on what?" Eloise found her voice, anger overriding fear. "On the fact that I didn't weep prettily at his funeral, that I've chosen to live quietly rather than remarry the first man who offered. Based on the fact that you were alone with him when he died." Jonathan pressed. "That you waited hours before calling for help. That you've shown no proper mourning. Taken up with this drifter?" "Careful," Weston warned, his voice low and dangerous. Jonathan ignored him, focusing on Eloise. "I know what you are. Thomas wrote me about your willfulness, your unnatural coldness. A proper wife would have—" "A proper wife?" Eloise laughed, harsh and bitter. "Like the first Mrs. Grant, the one who died of a broken neck falling downstairs without a single witness?" The room went very still. "How dare you?" Jonathan hissed. "I dare because I know what Thomas was." Eloise walked to the desk and pulled out the journal. "Your cousin kept very detailed records, Mr. Grant. Would you like me to read some entries? Perhaps the one about locking me in the root cellar for speaking to the pastor? Or the one about the corrections he administered?" She opened the journal, but Jonathan snatched it away. His face went white as he scanned the pages. "This proves nothing," he said finally. "A man has the right to discipline his wife. To beat her?" Eloise pulled back her sleeves, showing the scars. "To tie her down? To treat her as property?" Sheriff McKenna was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Grant, these are serious accusations." "Yes, they are." A new voice from the doorway. Sarah Holcomb entered, followed by her husband and several other townspeople, including Mrs. Chen and Bill Martinez. Accusations we should have taken seriously long ago. "What is this?" Jonathan demanded. "This," Reverend Holcomb said quietly, "is a group of citizens who've come to speak the truth. Something we should have done while Thomas was alive." Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her usually quiet voice firm. "I saw bruises, many times. Mrs. Grant would come for eggs, moving stiff, marks on her arms. I said nothing. To my shame, I said nothing. She nursed my Maria. Bill Martinez added. Sat with her 3 nights straight during the fever. Thomas came looking for her, drunk and angry. She went with him quiet-like, but next day she could barely walk. My Maria cried, begged me to help, but I was a coward. One by one, they spoke. Small observations, guilty silences, things seen but not acknowledged. The portrait they painted was of a young woman trapped in a nightmare while a town looked away. Sarah Holcomb produced a worn envelope. I received this letter from the first Mrs., Grant's sister, years ago, asking questions about her death. I should have answered. I should have told her about the bruises we all pretended not to see, the fear in that poor woman's eyes. Jonathan's face was mottled with rage. This is slander, hearsay. None of this proves— What about this? Weston pulled out another document. Thomas Grant owed significant debts. To the bank, to suppliers, even gambling debts from San Antonio. Debts that would consume most of the estate's value. You're lying. Sheriff McKenna can verify. The bank records are public. The sheriff nodded reluctantly. It's true. Thomas was leveraged heavy. The land's about all that's left of value. Which is why, Weston continued, you're so eager to get your hands on it. But here's what you didn't know. Mrs. Grant has been paying down those debts from her egg money, her sewing, every cent she could scrape together. She's got receipts. Eloise pulled out a leather folder, full of carefully kept records. Every payment documented. I may have been trapped in marriage, but I wasn't going to lose my home to his creditors. Jonathan looked between them all, his controlled facade cracking. You think you've won? You think this changes anything? She still let him die. Yes, Eloise said quietly. I did. The room went silent again. That night, he was drunk, angrier than I'd ever seen him because I'd smiled at another man. He dragged me to the barn, said he'd teach me to remember who I belonged to. He had me pushed against the stall when his horse spooked. I saw it rear. I could have warned him, pulled him away. Instead, I stepped back and let it happen. She looked directly at Jonathan. I watched your cousin die, and I felt nothing but relief. If that makes me a murderer, then so be it. But I'll tell you this, I'd do it again rather than live another day as his property. You heard her? Jonathan turned to the sheriff. She confessed. Sheriff McKenna looked tired and old. I heard a woman say she didn't save a man who was attacking her. That's not murder in my book. It's not murder in anyone's book, Reverend Holcomb added. It's survival. Jonathan looked around the room, seeing no support in any face. This isn't over. I'll take this to a higher court. With what money? Weston asked mildly. The estate you're so eager to claim is broke, and something tells me you've got debts of your own, or you wouldn't have come all this way for a piece of prairie land. Jonathan's flush told them Weston had hit the mark. Get out, Eloise said quietly. Get out of my house and don't come back. You'll regret this. Jonathan snarled, but he was already backing toward the door. All of you will regret protecting this survivor. Sarah Holcomb interrupted. This woman who's shown more strength than any of us. Yes, we'll protect her. It's the least we can do after failing her for so long. Jonathan left in a fury of threats and curses, his witnesses trailing behind. The sheriff tipped his hat to Eloise and followed, looking relieved to be done with it. As the room emptied, each person stopping to press Eloise's hand or murmur support, she found herself shaking. When they were alone, she sank into a chair. It's done, she whispered. It's finally done. Weston knelt beside her chair. You were brave today, braver than anyone I've known. I don't feel brave. I feel— She searched for words. Empty. Like I've been carrying this weight so long. I don't know how to stand without it. That's how healing starts, he said gently. First you survive, then you learn to live. She looked at him. This man who'd stood by her, fought for her, without asking for anything in return. What happens now? Now, he smiled slightly. Now you decide what you want, not what anyone else expects or demands. What you want. I don't know how to want things, she admitted. Thomas trained that out of me. Then start small. He stood, offering his hand. What do you want right this moment? Eloise looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his patient face. I want to not be afraid when you touch me. I want to trust that kindness doesn't come with a price. She took his hand, let him pull her to her feet. This time, she didn't let go. I want to learn who I am when I'm not afraid. She finished. Then that's where we start, Weston said, squeezing her hand gently. One day at a time, one choice at a time. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of hope, Eloise felt the first stirring of something she'd thought dead forever. Not just survival, but the possibility of actually living. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. It was, she thought, about time. The hearing was set for the first week of November, when the circuit judge would arrive in Cedar Bluff. Word spread quickly through the county. The widow Grant would face formal inquiry into her husband's death. Despite the town's show of support, Eloise knew that legal proceedings were different from neighbors' sympathy. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, she and Weston worked tirelessly to prepare. He helped her organize every piece of evidence: Thomas's journal, receipts for debt payments, testimonies from townspeople willing to speak. But it was the nights that proved hardest, when doubt crept in like cold wind through the cracks. What if they don't believe me? She asked one evening as they sorted papers by lamplight. What if Jonathan has influence with the judge? Then we keep fighting. Weston replied simply, truth has a way of surfacing, even in dark water. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and bitter, the first real cold snap of winter. Eloise dressed carefully in her most respectable black dress, hands trembling as she pinned up her hair. When Weston arrived to escort her to town, she saw he'd put on his best clothes too, a proper jacket and string tie that made him look both handsome and uncomfortable. You clean up well, she said, trying for lightness. Feel like a dressed-up scarecrow, he admitted, tugging at his collar, but figured you deserved someone who looked respectable standing beside you. The courthouse was packed. It seemed every soul in Cedar Bluff had come to witness the proceedings. Jonathan sat at the plaintiff's table with a lawyer from San Antonio, a sharp-faced man named Cornelius Ashford, who looked at Eloise like she was something distasteful. Judge Samuel Whitman was an older man with tired eyes and silver whiskers. He called the court to order with a heavy rap of his gavel. We're here to examine the circumstances surrounding the death of Thomas Grant, he began. This is not a criminal trial, but an inquiry to determine if further investigation is warranted. Mr. Ashford, you may begin. The lawyer stood, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of practiced oratory. Your Honor, we intend to show that Eloise Grant had both motive and opportunity to cause her husband's death, that she failed to render aid, delayed in seeking help, and has shown a callous disregard for his memory that speaks to guilty conscience. He called Jonathan first, who painted a picture of Thomas as a generous man, a pillar of the community, whose young wife was cold and ungrateful. Then came witnesses who testified to Eloise's unnatural behavior, her lack of tears at the funeral, her quick acceptance of Weston as a tenant, her refusal of suitors. She never loved him, declared Mrs. Prudence Carruthers, the banker's wife. What kind of wife doesn't weep for her husband? When it was time for the defense, Eloise's lawyer, a young man named David Markham, whom Weston had found in the neighboring county, began quietly. Your Honor, we don't dispute that Mrs. Grant didn't mourn her husband in the conventional way. We intend to show why. He called Sarah Holcomb first. The minister's wife spoke clearly about the bruises she'd seen, the fear in Eloise's eyes, the way Thomas would grip his wife's arm hard enough to leave marks. I should have spoken sooner, she said, looking directly at Eloise. We all should have. Mrs. Chen testified next, her soft voice requiring everyone to lean forward. She told of morning visits where Eloise could barely move, of powder hastily applied to cover bruises, of a young woman growing thinner and quieter with each passing month. Then Bill Martinez took the stand. The old rancher's voice was rough with emotion as he described the night Thomas came for Eloise during his wife's illness. He was drunk, angry she'd left without permission. She went with him quiet-like, didn't want to disturb Maria. Next day she came back, could barely walk, told us she fell. We knew she was lying. We knew, and we did nothing. We did. One by one, witnesses painted a picture of a marriage that was more imprisonment than partnership. Doctor Harrison testified about treating injuries consistent with physical abuse. The seamstress spoke of letting out and taking in dresses to hide weight loss and swelling. Then Markham introduced Thomas's journal. Ashford objected immediately. This could be fabricated. I can verify the handwriting. The bank manager interrupted from the gallery. I have years of Thomas Grant's signatures and correspondence. Judge Whitman allowed the journal to be read. As Markham recited entry after entry, the methodical recording of punishments and corrections, the courtroom grew very still. Even those who'd supported Thomas looked uncomfortable. Finally, Eloise herself was called to testify. She took the stand with her chin high, though her hands shook in her lap. Markham's questions were gentle, leading her through the story of her marriage, the debts that forced it, the escalating abuse, the isolation and control. Tell us about the night your husband died, he said softly. Eloise closed her eyes briefly, then opened them to find Weston's steady gaze in the gallery. He nodded slightly, and she drew strength from it. He was drunk, angrier than usual because I'd smiled at the Watson boy after church, just smiled at a child who'd shown me his new puppy. Thomas saw it as defiance. She described being dragged to the barn, the threats, the violence, beginning. Her voice was steady but quiet as she told of the horse spooking, of the moment she could have acted but didn't. I saw the horse rear. I saw it coming down, and I stepped back. She looked directly at the judge. I could have saved him, and I chose not to. If that makes me guilty of murder, then I am guilty. But I would make the same choice again rather than endure another night of his ownership. Ownership? Ashford pounced on the word. You were his wife, not his slave. There was no difference in Thomas Grant's mind. Eloise replied. I was property he'd purchased with debt forgiveness. He told me so every day. Ashford tried to twist her words, to paint her as calculating. But Eloise held firm. When he pressed about her relationship with Weston, suggesting impropriety, she met his insinuations with dignity. Mr. Harlow has shown me nothing but respect and kindness. If that seems improper to you, perhaps you should examine why you find decency so suspicious. The closing arguments were passionate. Ashford painted Eloise as a black widow who'd married for money and killed for freedom. Markham spoke of a young woman who'd survived years of torture and made a split-second decision to save her own life. Judge Whitman retired to consider. The weight felt eternal. Eloise sat between Weston and Markham, aware of every whisper in the gallery, every stare. When the judge returned, his expression was grave. This court has heard disturbing testimony about the nature of the Grant marriage. While the law of this time gives husbands certain rights over their wives, those rights do not extend to the systematic abuse described here. He looked at Eloise. Mrs. Grant, by your own admission, you chose not to save your husband's life. However, this choice came in a moment when you were under attack, in fear for your safety. The law recognizes the right of self-defense. The gavel came down. I find no grounds for criminal charges. This inquiry is closed. The courtroom erupted. Jonathan shot to his feet, shouting about corruption and conspiracy. But the sheriff was already moving to escort him out. Supporters surrounded Eloise, offering congratulations and apologies in equal measure. But she only had eyes for Weston, who hung back, letting others have their moment. When the crowd finally thinned, he approached. It's over, she said wonderingly. This part is, he agreed. The rest is just beginning. They walked out together into the cold November air. Snow was starting to fall, the first of the season, turning the muddy streets white and clean. Thank you, Eloise said as they reached her buggy, for believing me, for standing by me. You don't need to thank me for doing what's right. She turned to face him fully. What happens now, between us? I mean, Weston was quiet for a moment, studying her face. Whatever you want to happen, We can stay as we are, neighbors, friends, or we can see what else we might be. But only if you're ready, only if it's what you want. Eloise thought about the long road that had brought her here, the walls she'd built and the ones that had fallen. She thought about trust and choice and the terrifying possibility of happiness. "I'd like to try," she said softly, "to see what else we might be." Weston smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his weathered face. "Then we try. No rush, no expectations, just possibility." As snow continued to fall, covering the harsh landscape in gentle white, Eloise felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not just freedom from the past, but anticipation for the future. The hearing had declared her innocent in the eyes of the law. Now, perhaps, she could begin to forgive herself, and maybe, just maybe, learn to love again, not from obligation or ownership, but from choice. That, she thought as Weston helped her into the buggy with his customary gentle care, would be the greatest freedom of all. Winter settled over Cedar Bluff like a blessing, blanketing the harsh landscape in pristine white. The months following the hearing brought a strange new rhythm to Eloise's life. Without the weight of legal threats and whispered accusations, she found herself learning what it meant to simply exist without fear. Weston maintained his respectful distance, but their lives began to intertwine in small, meaningful ways. He'd appear when heavy snow needed clearing, working alongside her in comfortable silence. She'd bring him hot meals when bitter winds kept him working late with his cattle. They were building something together, not yet a romance, but a foundation of trust that felt more solid than any she'd known. Spring arrived with its usual prairie drama, thunderstorms that shook the earth, wildflowers that carpeted the hills overnight. Eloise stood in her garden one April morning, hands deep in soil, when she heard the familiar sound of Weston's approach. "Got something for you," he said, dismounting with unusual care. In his arms was a small bundle wrapped in his jacket. As he came closer, the bundle moved, and a tiny face peered out. A child, perhaps 2 years old, with dark curls and solemn eyes. "Found her by Miller's Creek," Weston explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Just left there with a note pinned to her dress." Eloise took the child carefully, feeling the tiny body trembling despite the warm wrapping. The note was brief. "Can't feed another mouth. Her name is Grace." "Those damned—" Weston caught himself. "Sorry, but what kind of people abandon a baby?" "Desperate ones," Eloise said softly, already swaying instinctively to soothe the child. "The drought last year hit a lot of folks hard. Sometimes pride breaks before it lets you ask for help." Grace, if that was truly her name, studied Eloise with those serious dark eyes, one small fist clutching the fabric of her dress. Something shifted in Eloise's chest, a maternal ache she'd thought Thomas had beaten out of her. "What do we do?" Weston asked. And Eloise noticed the "we," how naturally it came. "First, we get her warm and fed, then—" She looked down at the child, who was now resting her head against Eloise's shoulder with the trust only the very young possess. "Then I suppose we figure out if anyone's looking for her." But even as she said it, Eloise knew. This child had been abandoned, not lost. And looking at Weston's face, she could see he knew it too. They brought Grace inside, where Eloise fashioned a makeshift bed from dresser drawers and bathed the child gently. Grace submitted to these ministrations with the same solemn acceptance, though she brightened considerably when offered warm milk and soft bread. "She's been cared for," Eloise observed, noting the child's relatively clean condition and evident health. Whoever left her loved her enough to keep her well until they couldn't anymore. Weston had been watching from the doorway, maintaining his usual respectful distance. But when Grace held out her arms to him, babbling something that might have been up, he moved without hesitation, lifting her with surprising gentleness. "Hey there, little bit," he murmured, and Grace immediately grabbed his nose, producing the first sound they'd heard from her, a delighted giggle. Eloise felt her heart constrict at the sight. This strong, quiet man holding a baby with such natural ease. "You're good with her," Had younger siblings once, he said, a shadow crossing his face. Long time ago. They spent the day establishing a routine around their unexpected visitor. By evening, Grace had thoroughly charmed them both, toddling between them on unsteady legs, babbling in her own language, when she finally fell asleep in the makeshift cradle. Eloise and Weston sat by the fire, processing the day's strange turn. "We should tell Sheriff McKenna," Eloise said. "See if anyone's reported a missing child." "We should," Weston agreed. "But somehow, I don't think anyone will." They were quiet for a moment, watching the fire dance. Then Eloise voiced what they were both thinking. "I want to keep her. That's a big decision." "I know. But when I held her," she struggled for words. "Thomas always said I was too cold to be a proper mother, that I'd never have maternal feelings. But with Grace, I felt whole, like a piece I didn't know was missing just clicked into place." Weston moved his chair closer, still maintaining some distance, but near enough that she could feel his warmth. "You'd make a wonderful mother, Eloise. Anyone can see that. A single woman with my reputation. The town might have shown support during the hearing, but taking in a child? Then don't do it as a single woman." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Eloise's breath caught. "Weston, I know we said slow. I know you need time, but maybe this is what we've been building toward." He turned to face her fully. "I'm not Thomas. I'd never try to own you or control you. But I'd stand beside you, provide for you and Grace, give you both the protection of my name if you'd have it. You're asking me to marry you because of a foundling child?" "No." His voice was quiet but firm. "I'm asking because I've been falling in love with you since the day you fixed your own water pump, because you're the strongest woman I've ever known, because when I think about the future, I can't imagine it without you. Grace just makes it clearer, that's all." Eloise felt tears threatening. "I don't know if I can be a wife again, the word itself." "Then don't be a wife. Be my partner, my equal, my friend who shares my bed when you're ready." Not a moment before. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. "I want to build a life with you, Eloise, not have you serve mine." She looked at their joined hands, his calloused and gentle, hers work-worn but steady. "What if I'm never ready for the physical part? Then we have companionship and partnership and that little girl in there to raise. That's more than many marriages have." From the other room, Grace whimpered in her sleep. Eloise started to rise, but Weston was already moving. "I'll check on her." She watched him go, this man who offered everything while demanding nothing. When he returned, Grace was in his arms, her small face tucked against his neck. "Bad dream, I think," he whispered. She settled right down, looking at them, the man she was learning to trust, and the child who'd arrived like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. Eloise made her decision. "Yes," she said softly. Weston looked up from Grace's sleeping face. "Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, we'll raise Grace together. Yes to all of it, whatever we can build." His smile was like sunrise after a long winter. "You sure?" "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But I'm sure." They were married 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony with Sarah Holcomb and Bill Martinez as witnesses. Eloise wore her mother's blue dress, saved all these years. Weston wore his uncomfortable Sunday clothes with better grace this time. Grace, officially adopted through the proper channels, toddled between them in a new dress misses. Chen had sewn. The town's reaction was mixed, but mostly positive. The story of the abandoned child softened even hard hearts, and seeing Eloise bloom under gentle treatment changed more minds than any legal verdict could have. Their wedding night was spent as many of their evenings were, sitting by the fire, talking quietly while Grace slept. When bedtime came, Weston kissed her forehead gently and turned toward the barn where he'd been sleeping. "Where are you going?" Eloise asked. "To bed, like we agreed. When you're ready." "I know what we agreed." She took a breath, gathering courage. "But maybe maybe you could stay just to sleep." "I'd like to try not being alone." His eyes softened. "Just to sleep." And so they shared a bed for the first time, fully clothed, a careful space between them. But during the night, Eloise woke to find she'd moved closer in sleep, her head on his shoulder, his arm careful around her. Instead of the panic she expected, she felt only peace. This was what she'd never had with Thomas, the safety to be vulnerable, the freedom to choose closeness. As dawnlight crept through the windows and Grace began stirring in her cradle, Eloise knew they had a long journey ahead, learning to trust, to love, to be a family. But for the first time in her life, the future looked like something to embrace rather than endure. "Good morning, Mrs. Harlow," Weston murmured, awake but not moving, letting her choose whether to stay close or pull away. She chose to stay. "Good morning, Mr. Harlow." Grace's babbling grew more insistent, and they rose together to face their first full day as a family. It would be imperfect, sometimes difficult, occasionally painful as old wounds were tested, but it would be theirs, chosen freely, built on mutual respect and growing love. And that, Eloise thought as she watched Weston lift their daughter with easy affection, was the greatest gift of all. Not just survival, but the chance to truly live. 25 years had passed since Grace came into their lives, transforming two wounded souls into a family. The ranch had prospered under their joint care, expanding from a small homestead into one of the county's most successful operations. But more than land and cattle, they had built something precious, a reputation as a haven for those who needed second chances. Eloise sat at her desk by the window, silver threading through her dark hair, reading the latest letter that had arrived. These letters came regularly now, ever since the book. "Another one?" Weston asked, entering with 2 cups of coffee. His hair had gone completely gray, but his eyes remained the same steady storm cloud color that had first earned her trust. "From Boston this time," Eloise said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "A young woman trapped in a marriage much like mine was. She wants to know how I found the courage to survive." The book had been Catherine Morrison's idea. The journalist from back east had arrived 3 years ago, seeking the woman who survived hell and built heaven from its ashes, as she'd dramatically put it. Eloise had initially refused, but Weston had seen the possibility in it. "Your story could help others." He'd said simply, "Show them there's life after darkness." So Eloise had told her story, frankly and without prettiness. Catherine had written it with skill and sensitivity, publishing it under a pseudonym to protect their privacy. But somehow, women found it. They always found it. "Will you write back?" Weston asked, settling into his own chair. "I always do." She looked at him over her spectacles. "Remember when I thought no one would understand? That I was alone in what I'd endured?" "You were never alone," he said softly. "You just couldn't see us through the walls you'd built." A knock at the door interrupted them. Grace entered, now a woman of 27, married to the minister's son, with 3 children of her own. She had Eloise's determined chin and Weston's steady presence, though neither feature came from blood. "Ma, Pa, the children want to hear the story again," she said with fond exasperation. "About how you found me." "Which version?" Eloise asked, smiling. "The one where your father rescued a princess from a riverbank, or the truth?" "The truth. Always the truth," Grace said firmly. "That's what you taught me. That truth has power, even when it's hard." They gathered in the large parlor they'd added to the house, where Grace's children, Samuel, Sarah, and little Thomas, named for hope rather than harm, waited with the barely contained energy of the young. As Weston settled into his storytelling chair, other figures appeared in the doorway. Maria Martinez, now grown with children of her own. The Watson boy, now Dr. Watson, who'd brought his family to visit. Even Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, who'd traveled from San Francisco to meet the woman her grandmother had spoken of with such respect. The house filled with the next generation, drawn by the same thing that brought the letters, the need to understand how people could transform pain into purpose. "Tell us about the night you decided to fight back," young Sarah requested, curled against her grandmother's side. Eloise exchanged glances with Weston. They'd agreed years ago to tell the truth to any who asked, but to tell it gently, with hope rather than bitterness. "I didn't fight back all at once," Eloise began. "Courage isn't always a lightning strike. Sometimes it's a tiny seed that grows so slowly you don't notice until one day you're standing in its shade." She told them about the years of darkness, speaking carefully but honestly about Thomas's cruelty, about the night he died and her choice to save herself, about Weston's patience and the slow rebuilding of trust. "But the most important part," she said, looking at each young face, "is that healing isn't a destination. It's a journey you take every day. Some days are harder than others, but with the right people beside you, even the hard days become bearable." "Like us?" little Thomas asked hopefully. "Exactly like you," Weston confirmed, ruffling the boy's hair. As evening fell and families began departing, Eloise stood on the porch she'd once defended so fiercely, watching the next generation scatter across land that had seen so much pain transformed into joy. Grace joined her, slipping an arm through hers. "The letters are increasing, aren't they? Every week brings more. Catherine says the book has sold thousands of copies." "Does it bother you, all these strangers knowing your story?" Eloise considered. "I spent so many years in silence, convinced my pain was unique, shameful. Now I know better. Every letter proves that darkness tries to convince us we're alone, but we're not. We never were. You should write your own book," Grace suggested. "In your own words." "Maybe I will." Eloise smiled at her daughter, not of her body but absolutely of her heart. "Though I think the most important chapters are still being written." Weston emerged from the house, carrying Eloise's journal, not the one filled with pain, but the new one, where she recorded the letters, the visits, the slowly expanding circle of women who found strength in shared survival. "Another family from Denver wants to visit next month," he reported. "Woman read your story, recognized her own situation, left with her children, starting fresh. We'll need to prepare the guest house," Eloise said automatically. They'd built it 5 years ago when the visits became regular, a place where women could stay while they found their feet. As stars emerged in the vast prairie sky, the three of them stood together, the family built from choice rather than chance, from love rather than law. "I've been thinking," Weston said quietly, "about what you said at the hearing all those years ago, about watching me at night, my campfire in the darkness. What about it? Maybe that's what we've built here, a campfire in the darkness, a place where people can come to get warm, see they're not alone, gather strength for the journey ahead." Eloise leaned into him, this man who'd seen her at her worst and helped her find her best. "When you asked to see who I was at night, did you imagine this?" "No," he admitted, pressing a kiss to her silver hair. "This is better than anything I could have imagined." Grace squeezed both their hands. "The children want to know if we can make this a real tradition. Monthly gatherings where people share their stories. Find community." "A storytelling circle," Eloise considered, "where truth is honored and survival celebrated. We could call it the Prairie Fire Gatherings," Grace suggested, "because that's what you've started. Ma, a fire that spreads light across the darkness." As they stood there planning, Eloise felt the profound satisfaction of a life transformed, from a frightened girl sold to pay debts, to a woman who'd found her voice and used it to help others find theirs. The journey had been long, often painful, but it had led here, to this moment, this family, this purpose, inside the house. Weston's sketches covered one wall, drawings of Eloise through the years. The scared widow, the tentative friend, the blooming partner, the fierce mother, the wise elder, all versions of her, all true, all part of the journey from survival to thriving. "Read me what you're writing," Grace requested as they went inside. Eloise opened her journal to the latest entry. Today, another letter came, Another soul reaching across the miles to say, "Me too, I understand, I survived." With each letter, each visit, each shared story, the truth becomes clearer. We are not alone in our pain, and therefore we need not be alone in our healing. The darkness tells us we are isolated, shameful, broken beyond repair. But the light reveals the truth. We are connected, powerful, and capable of transformation that defies those who would break us. She closed the journal and looked at her family, the one she'd chosen, the one that had chosen her. "Let me see who you are at night," she murmured, remembering Weston's first real words to her. "What's that, Ma?" Grace asked. "Just remembering," Eloise said, taking Weston's hand. "How the most important journeys begin with someone willing to see us in our darkness, and stay anyway." As the prairie wind sang through the grass and their house settled into evening warmth, Eloise Grant Harlow knew with bone-deep certainty that every scar had been worth it. Every tear had watered the ground for this harvest of hope. She had been broken, yes, but in the breaking, she had discovered something unbreakable: the human capacity to transform suffering into strength, isolation into community, survival into abundance. And that, she thought as she prepared for bed in a house full of love and purpose, was the greatest truth of all, that our darkest nights can become the very light that guides others home. Thank you for listening to this tale of love, survival, and redemption in the Old West. If you're enjoying these stories around our Wild West Campfire, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles, just as Eloise connected with kindred spirits through her letters. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories that explore the untold lives of frontier women and men who transformed hardship into hope. What did Eloise's journey mean to you? Share your thoughts below. Your words might be the campfire light someone else needs today.